Hello guys, welcome back to Not Just Mecha. It's Marco here, and today we'll talk about a lot of advanced topics painting a bust. Last week, I used this lovely little bust to explain my workflow in rendering realistic eyes, but you asked for more. And since I left the camera on during the whole process, here is a little masterclass with a lot of juicy stuff and ideas that we can also expand in future videos. Display models take time and they don't fit well in the YouTube format. So I had to focus the screen time on the parts I think are more important. But I believe this is a good way to start introducing more advanced topics, following the increasing skills of our community. As always, feel free to tell me in the comments what is interesting and useful for you, so I can use the feedback and your ideas for future, more specific videos. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button to always know what happens on the channel. And if you want to support my work, check my Patreon page. Patreon is the main reason why I can dedicate so much time to the videos and publish every single week. So, if you like my content, consider to join the community. Thanks a million, guys! The first step is to choose the main angle in which the bust will be presented on the plinth. Display models don't move around like gaming figures, and they are meant to sit on a shelf delivering their story in a static way, similar to an artwork framed on the wall. This apparently trivial choice is the foundation of the whole storytelling, and working on a bust this becomes even more important because the relation between the viewer and the model all happens with and around the face. I can keep the body in the middle with the head turned on this side, making him look to something in the distance. But I think I can create a more powerful and engaging scene pointing the face in our direction. The general idea is about one of the poor souls of Mordheim finding a warpstone nugget on the floor and looking down in a mix of surprise and greed. Setting the MacGuffin of the story between us and the figure will make us part of the scene, and of an imaginary standoff to whoever takes the magic stone first. I left the model primed in black inside the box for a while, and I really need to see better all the details before committing to a strong, definitive light. So I play safe, spraying a light coat of neutral grey. I focus the light on the face for obvious reasons, but as you can see this layer is very general and diffused to let me catch and read all the various elements and textures. Now that I can see what I'm going to paint, I can switch to pure titanium white and perfect shape, position and intensity of my lights. I usually create the entire grey modulation using only transparent layers of white over the black primer, but here the grey intermediate step gave me the opportunity to understand better what I need to highlight. I also set few interesting silhouettes to separate better the different planes of the model, introducing an illustrational sense of the volumes and exaggerating their three-dimensional presence. We cannot rely on natural light to create a sense of volume and scale, even working on large figures, not to mention pathos and theatrical drama. I move immediately to the wet palette because I want to complete the boring stage of the basic midtones as quickly as possible, and move to the fun part as soon as I can. I think an approach based on sketching, roughness and textures suits well the subjects and the story I want to tell, and I cannot create that kind of sensations with the airbrush. Plus, I just want to use the brush, and following the impulse is always part of an effective session of happy painting. I often see intermediate painters losing a lot of time trying to make this layer super opaque, uniform and smooth. Strangely, beginners are much more relaxed about this, and they are on the right track. The midtones are not so important, and you should consider them more as a base to build a flowing modulation of lights and shadows than a real entity. At the end, these pure basic tones will be represented only by a fraction of a millimeter, naturally turning into lights and shadows and their tones. For this reason, in this stage I tend to use paints able to tint a surface with a single pass, relatively transparent to keep the information of the value sketch, but with a good saturation to fight the power of the white underneath and deliver the hues I have in mind. Inks, high flow paints and contrast paints all have these properties and make a great job in setting the basic tones. Yup, you can use contrast paints even on display models. They are just paint. I want something deeper for the black parts, so I mix a chromatic black using green and violet. The mix of the two complementary tones has a bluish note that becomes more subtle, increasing the opacity and losing the luminosity of the white from below. You can easily modulate these parameters to obtain a variety of interesting blacks. Okay, now you are entering in the blender of information and techniques that is my brain. Try to keep up and let me know if this makes sense. I base the skin with a quick, cheater version of a classic Verdaccio. Verdaccio is an underpainting technique and a specific paint color first used by the Italian fresco painters of the early Renaissance. Verdaccio is used like grisaille to quickly establish tonal values, but using a soft greenish grey for the shadows of the flesh tones that makes them crazily realistic and full of depth. Traditionally, the color is a mixture of Mars black and yellow ochre, plus white for the lights. And this mix looks suspiciously like Plague Bearer flesh. Check my video about the Zorn palette, because these are also basic tones in that limited palette system. Everything is connected. Frazetta also used these tones a lot in his work. I apply the Verdaccio tone over a simple grisaille, and I obtain a full Verdaccio base for my skin in 2 simple steps. The simplified version, without following me in the rabbit hole, is that Plague Bearer flesh is a good, interesting base for any kind of realistic flesh. Okay, in this stage it looks like a zombie skin, but trust me, it will provide a great natural foundation for the proper skin tones. The last step of the base work is the check pattern of the jacket. We are used to paint free hands in the last stages of a paint job, but like in this case, they are integral part of the material they are weaved into, so they catch light in the same way and generate similar lights and shadows. It's better to set these elements in place from the very beginning and work the whole area in a coherent way. Here I sketch lights and shadows on the red leather of the cowl. I follow the general pattern set by my value sketch, but I quickly introduce colors and stronger value jumps, modeling the 3-dimensional shapes like a 2-dimensional artwork. All I need to know about position and intensity is already on the model, so I just have to fill the spaces and have fun. Thanks to the Verdaccio base and how it will interact with the skin tones, I can keep my palette super simple, using just a few pre-made colors and still delivering a crazy amount of visual depth and information. Pure red is an essential part of bringing the skin to the side of the living, adding the sensation of the blood running under the skin with simple filters and glazes. I'll publish part of the real-time footage on my Patreon, but I really believe that at this speed you can better appreciate how the skin changes in few steps. Here, understanding the general flow is much more useful than the single brushstrokes. This is also part of the beauty of the sketching workflow. Every single step is extremely simple and straightforward when analyzed by itself. You can see that even the few tones on the palette are quite basic and mostly used straight from the bottle, but the final complexity you get is far superior to the sum of the parts. The work on the yellow fabric is based on stippling, to obtain a fine textures of old, rough wool. What's interesting here is the presence of those 2 green tones on the palette. The left side will be into the cold tones of night and the bluish light of a fantasy full moon. So I start from now pushing the yellow into colder tones that will easily support and connect the bluish tones I'll glaze later on top of this side. Again, if you want to paint believable, realistic textures, they have to be part of the shading, highlighting process, and not simply put on top of the modulation. Overlapping the color and the physical volume of 5 lines of paint, you can create the illusion of the depth of hundreds of real interwoven fibers. I alternate vertical and horizontal lines, every time pushing the light a bit more towards the vector and intensity of the main light I set at the beginning with the airbrush. Every fiber is a single little entity, but altogether they make the general surface. And I have to render these two behaviors, fusing them in something coherent. Luckily, we have plenty of references to check in the real world. I took this shot before starting the work on the eyes. I work in the corners for the needs of recording, that's not important. The interesting part is to see how simple the palette is compared to what I have on the model at this stage. Basic pools of tones, used mostly pure and undiluted, few simple mixes, and pools for quick glazes and filters. Time to smooth out the sketch. The idea is the same of smoothing with glazes, and what I am applying here is precisely a glaze, but quickly applied with the airbrush. I use a semi-transparent tone close to my initial base to unify the modulation under the general hue of the area. Since I'm using this glazing only to soften the brushstrokes in a general way and not for shading, for example, I don't need the precise control and directional flow of the brush. For that kind of application, the brush is much more effective and easy to control. But here I can cut a lot of time of, let's be honest, boring work. I lose a bit of contrast, but I'm in a stage where I can easily and quickly intervene on this aspect, and it's something I had to do anyway working on details and definition, but I cut a ton of glazing time, so at the end the balance is super positive. You can see how much difference these steps makes on the work on the hood. And this is also the last time I use the airbrush on this model. Back to the wet palette. Before working on the lights, I want to reintroduce a bit more textures on the leather of the cowl. The sketch was rougher here, and I needed a couple of extra layers to smooth it out. So I want to bring back a bit of movement before fusing everything into the strong environmental lights. I like to work these environmental light conditions on top of an advanced general painting of the various elements, materials and their volumes, so I can render in a more realistic way how every bit interacts in its own way with the external light. I prepare a yellow filter adding water and glaze medium, and I apply it to the whole right side to start building the idea of the fire of a torch held on that side. And I do the same with the light blue on the right side. These are filters and quite heavy in their content of paint, so much faster than a glaze. And I don't bother to use the airbrush for this. 4 or 5 of these layers and you get something like this. I had to add a drop of matte varnish in every pool because I used too much glaze medium and everything started to become super glossy. At this point, it's just a matter of adding the high and highest lights. Again, if something catches light, it means it has a volume, therefore it's a texture. And since this guy is covered in rough fabric, thick wool and old leather, I can build this whole layer using interesting textures enhanced by the new powerful lights. The colors in this stage are very simple, because I'm rendering the extreme consequence of the environmental lights, and I have to manage only a short orange-yellow range, and a simple light-blue modulation. Before going too far with the two side lights, risking to lose the space for the warpstone glow, I start introducing the green from below. I want something like a triangle of light coming from below and converging on his eye. And I feel that if I start with a filter, I can't make it sharp and directional as I want. So I reverse the process, starting mapping the vector of the green light with a medium-high value of green, starting from the edges. This will give me a better sense of the space I need to fill with the filter. Again, few layers of diluted paint stabilized with a bit of glaze medium are used to do the trick. In the last steps, I turn the filter into a glaze for more control and to decrease its opacity that is starting to be quite solid in the center part. I use a gold and high flow fluorescent green for a final kick in the green highlights. The last steps are all about creating the final definition, making the details I already have sharper and sharper. My palette at this point is just a consequence of all the work done before, and since everything was built with simple tones, it shows the same direct simplicity until the end. Deciding when a model is finished is always difficult, especially if you're having a lot of fun with it. Luckily, working on a bust is almost impossible to paint too many details or too much definition. And here is the final result. I didn't paint a bust for a while and I almost forgot how much I love this format. About 13 hours of happy painting, in a moment when I really needed a pause from gaming models, and their load of expectations and pre-existing backgrounds. It's like painting a distilled version of a model where only the funniest elements remain. And the best part is that despite the dimension, you can easily transfer what you learn in any other scale. Again, check my Patreon page for more real-time footage, especially if you need a focus on a specific step. And tell me in the comments what topic would you like to see in its own dedicated video. If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can ask me anything down below with a comment, and you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials. And if you want to support the channel and my work, check my Patreon page and join the community, or maybe ask for a commission. See you next week, guys!